Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's now time for me to introduce Nora. Anybody who has spent any time focusing on the efforts to establish some kind of a climate action program in Oregon will know Nora because she used to work with the Oregon Environmental Council and is now Oregon Director of Climate Solutions. And Nora has been following the discussions of the plan, the proposal to try and adjust the climate protection program and replacing it with a cap and trade program. And I won't say any more about that because Nora is going to talk about that history when she starts her presentation. So I'm going to pause for a moment and let Dale switch to Nora.
And thank you all so much for inviting me to join this evening. I am such a huge fan of SOCAN, have really appreciated the partnership with the organization and in particular with Alan over the past 6 years. As Alan mentioned, it has been a long journey working to advance and implement and defend a cap and invest program in Oregon. Again, Nora Apter, Oregon Director of Climate Solutions. I'm very pleased to spend the evening with you all really digging into the history of cap and invest in Oregon. I wish I could have heard your conversations in terms of, how did we get here? Where are we going? But that really is the crux of the conversation. How has this conversation evolved in Oregon? Where are we today? And where are we potentially going from here? I do have some slides. As you might imagine, with an economy-wide program, this does tend to get a little bit wonky. So appreciate you all bearing with me as we dig in. And I'm particularly eager to get to the Q&A discussion. I'm sure folks have a lot of juicy questions in mind, and we'll have even more as the conversation goes along. So really looking forward to that part of the conversation. Last thing I'll say is just I wish so much I could be in person with you all. As Alan knows, had some in-person conflicts up in Portland where I'm based that prevented that, but I do really hope to be able to join you all in person for a future meeting because nothing beats that FaceTime. So with that, I will go ahead and share my slides. Hopefully that is coming through for you all. I can see it on the screen. Great. Okay, so we are going to jump right in with a brief flyover of history. If I were to include every single milestone of the evolution of cap and invest in Oregon on one slide, the text would be so tiny you would need a microscope. It has been a very storied journey to where we are today. And that journey continues. But these are some of the highlights just to really emphasize this is by no means a new conversation. I see former Senator Dembro on the call with us. Hard to imagine anyone other than Senator Dembro who knows this journey as well. But for those who are newer to the conversation, Oregon's been considering a cap over our emissions across sectors for nearly 2 decades. That's when the legislature first created the Oregon Global Warming Commission, and in that charge directed the commission to examine what could a cap and trade program look like in Oregon. That was the language that was more frequently used way back in 2007. Over the course of another decade, there were more conversations, many legislative work groups, many of which I'm sure Senator Dembro was at the helm of. Many of you may have been closely tracking or participating in as well. Part of that process was the Department of Environmental Quality doing some deep analysis in terms of what could a cap and invest program look like in Oregon. All of this culminates in 2019, the legislature taking a real run at cap and invest, the Clean Energy Jobs Bill. Unfortunately, that session ended in Republican-led walkouts that denied a quorum, and therefore denied a vote on this bill, among many others that got hung up in that. I will say I was still working on environmental policy at the federal level at that time in DC, and I can tell you the headlines reached as far as the East Coast. There was a lot of news, unfortunately negative, about all of these, walkouts, all the political turmoil over this cap and invest bill. Same thing happens in the 2020 short session. Just as I'm moving back to my home state of Oregon to work on climate policy, you can imagine I was a little scared for what I was getting myself into. The second year of walkouts in a row. Thankfully, just days after the 2020 walkout, again denying this vote on the legislative cap and invest bill, our then governor, Kate Brown, issued a sweeping executive order, EO 2004, which we called the Oregon Climate Action Plan, that she had promised to do if the legislature again failed to act on this monumental legislation. As Alan and others with SOCAN know very well, this really was, comprehensive, groundbreaking executive action. But most relevant to our conversation today was a directive to our Department of Environmental Quality to adopt rules to cap and reduce emissions from our top polluting sectors. While this is all happening in Oregon, our neighbors to the north actually succeed in legislatively adopting a cap and invest program, the Climate Commitment Act. And while this, of course, isn't, an Oregon-based action, it does have quite a bit of relevance for our conversation today, and for Oregon's consideration of a legislative cap and invest program, which we'll come back to, but that's why it's on the slide. So after the governor's executive order, there were years, 18 months to be exact, of rulemaking process, countless hours of rulemaking meetings, thousands of public comments across the state, to ultimately inform the development and adoption of our regulatory cap and invest program, which is the Climate Protection Program. This has been in place now since the end of 2021. There was a brief pause, which we will get into a little bit, but as you can imagine, oil and gas industry does not love this program, which sets a declining cap on emissions from our top polluting sectors. So there was litigation, a brief pause after the court ruled on a procedural technicality, but then another rulemaking, another adoption of the rules. And since the beginning of 2025, the CPP has again been the law of the land. So this is our context for today. We're going to zoom into a few key milestones on this timeline that are relevant to, again, where we are now and where we will potentially go as a state from here. So we'll come back to a part two of this, which is more recent context. What's happened since 2025 until to today, August 2026. So our first zoom in will be on the 2019 and 2020 sessions. As I disclosed, I was not here. I do feel like I bear some empathy scars from my colleagues who did live through these walkouts. But so I'm not going to focus too much on the politics and the specifics, not to keep calling Senator Denver out, but maybe he'd be willing to share some of his own scars during the Q&A. But what I do want to just talk through is what were the key features, and just use this as kind of a foundation as we move through this timeline and where we are now. So some key features of any cap and invest program are, spoiler, a cap on emissions. So an enforceable economy-wide cap. Under our previous potential proposed legislation, this would have regulated the electric sector, gas utilities, transportation fuel suppliers, and industrial sectors, with special treatment for that last sector, our large industrial emitters. This would have allowed DEQ to set a price on carbon and hold an auction to sell what are called allowances under that declining emissions cap. That revenue would then have been collected and invested toward climate mitigation and resilience activities. The past legislation did allow offsets, and those were limited in their treatment. But those are really, again, we could spend days really digging into the weeds. One important thing to note is that as introduced, the bill in 2020 would not have linked to other markets today. There are key thresholds for what it means to link to other states' markets, including, most importantly, I would say, matching the stringency of other programs. And that's, again, why we want to come back to, and we'll come back to, what's going on in Washington, who just went through this very long process of linking to California and Quebec's markets. I already talked through the process, so I'm not going to get too much into the weeds here, other than to highlight, in addition to many years and many legislative and agency work tables, et cetera, there were many, many stakeholders at the table, as you would expect and hope for a comprehensive program that regulates all parts of our economy, and has implications for labor, for environmental justice, for local government, et cetera. This is a significant program, and the past processes really made sure that those inputs could be gathered. But again, there was very strong opposition. The news that I saw, again, across the country was, timber unity, trucks circling the Capitol, just this intense fear-mongering of all of the harms that would come if Oregon dared to pass a cap on emissions and invest to support communities in the transition. But it did, silver lining, lay the groundwork for Oregon's climate protection program, as well as our foundational 100% clean electricity law, which unfortunately we won't have time to get into today, but it is an important part of our landscape. Okay, so it laid the groundwork for the climate protection program. We're now going to get into a bit more detail on this executive order, but specifically, what does the CPP do? Why do we love it so much? And a little bit of a preview of how does it differ from what a potential legislative linked cap and invest could look like. I'm not going to go through all of this. I previewed it already. There's been a lot of process, a ton of stakeholder input, a ton of work on behalf of our agency, the Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, that has gone into informing the rules that are the climate protection program, defending against industry litigation, restoring the rules, and supporting implementation of this program. I'm actually sitting in an active rulemaking right now with DEQ to determine the regulation of industrial emitters under this program. DEQ just met a really important milestone with the Community Climate Investment Program, which we'll talk about. Also say work continues that is, off the timeline that you see here. So, most important to highlight, there are some key similarities. You've heard me mention this is our regulatory cap and invest between what has been considered in the legislature, what Washington and other states have adopted, and what the climate protection program that we have today look like. Some key similarities are the declining cap, an enforceable declining reduction of emissions from our largest polluting sectors. Another key similarity, but also a difference, is investments. What is and I'll actually go to the next slide so this is a little bit clearer. Oh, okay, we'll stay here. So a key difference is because DEQ adopted these rules through their existing authority, they are not able to set a price on carbon. So they cannot hold an auction and sell compliance instruments under this declining cap. That means all of the allowances that a gas utility or a semiconductor manufacturer or a oil company receives for their required emission reduction under the cap is received for free. However, in order to comply with their required emissions reduction, they can, there are a few things they can do. They can directly reduce their emissions, so they can decarbonize their facility, invest in energy efficiency and electrification, cleaner fuels. Those are direct emissions reductions. There is trading allowed, so they can trade their free compliance instruments with other covered industries. So let's say you're a transportation fuel supplier, you've invested a lot in cleaner fuels, electrification, you're under your cap. You have all of these other free allowances. You can sell those to, say, a gas utility that maybe hasn't made those same investments and needs to comply. The third thing, though, that you have the option of doing if you are covered under this program is purchase a community climate investment credit. Community climate investments, or CCIs, are optional compliance mechanisms for a regulated entity to achieve part of their required emissions reductions. So they can't just purchase, endless CCIs and say, okay, we've done it, we've achieved our clean energy or our emissions reduction requirements. But they can do that for currently 15% of their required emissions reductions or compliance obligation, and then that will increase to 20%. What's really important about how stakeholders and DEQ designed the CCI program is that all of these investments will go toward clean energy projects in Oregon. So they must reduce emissions in the sectors covered by the CPP, prioritizing benefits for environmental justice communities with a specific set aside for tribes and tribal communities of 15%. And that's something we got as part of the restored rules in 2024. So just to summarize, it gets into the weeds pretty quickly. These are the key features, right? A declining cap over emissions, 50% reductions by 2035, 90% by 2050. There are a few different ways for businesses who are regulated to comply. One of those includes transformative investments in emissions reductions, prioritizing benefits for rural, low-income communities of color, coastal communities, and other communities that have been historically on the front lines of climate pollution and climate impacts. Just to round out the CPP section, this is an oft-used image that we have pulled from the Oregon Climate Action Commission and the Oregon Department of Energy that shows just how important the climate protection program is to achieving our statewide emissions reduction targets. The CPP, if well implemented, will achieve nearly half of our statewide climate pollution reduction targets by 2050. You can see the other big lever program is HB 2021. That's our clean electricity law that I mentioned earlier that works as a complementary program because the CPP does not regulate that sector. Okay, I hope this is all extremely clear and everybody could reset back. Here are the key pieces of the climate protection program, but it will hopefully become clearer if it isn't already. Okay, so going back to Washington, and we'll just skim over this so that we save plenty of time for discussion and where we are now. But as I mentioned, our partners to the north, way back in 2021, passed their version of Cap and Invest in the legislature. This is called the Climate Commitment Act. Similar to Oregon, this was a multi-year process with significant stakeholder input. Over the past many years, the legislature has gone back and made changes to the law with the goal of strengthening it to enable linkage to other markets. So after now 5 years, just this summer, Washington finally linked to California and Quebec. So that means we now have an almost west-wide carbon market. If we had a map, you would see our state as the missing piece. But I mentioned this I mentioned it for a couple reasons. One, Washington's program is extremely strong when we think about the stringency of the cap of those required emissions reductions, as well as sideboards on where the investments from revenue generated under the program go. We also have a lot to learn. And the second reason I mention it is, so that's kind of the policy context in terms of influence potentially on Oregon. The second is political, and that is what I just mentioned of Oregon is kind of the missing chessboard. So there's pressure, which we will get into, for Oregon to join this west-wide market from within the state, but there's also pressure from our neighbors who are excited about Oregon joining them in this carbon market. I'll come back to some of these, some of the differences and features, but what's really important to call out is this 95% emissions reduction target from 1990 levels by 2050. As you'll recall, our climate, and the fact that electricity is covered under this program. They do also have a similar bill, a law to HB 2021, so another bill that covers the electricity sector. But this declining cap is really the backstop. So the coverage is more expansive than our CPP, and the emissions reduction targets are also stronger. It's a 1990 starting point as opposed to CPP, which is 2017 to 2019 averaged. And it's a 95% reduction by 2050 as opposed to 90%. Another important piece to note is just, because like other legislatively passed cap and invest programs, Washington has set a price on carbon and has held auctions every year since the Climate Commitment Act was adopted in 2021. They have raised significant revenue for investing in clean energy projects in the state. In the first year that since it was up and running, it raised nearly $2 billion through allowances that were then invested in clean energy, transportation, community resilience projects. 40% of those funds were invested toward or prioritized for overburdened communities, and then on top of that, an additional 10% for tribes. So that is a lot of money for clean energy. Okay. This is a snapshot, which I'm happy to come back to, but really just shows key differences between Oregon CPP, Washington CCA. I already covered most of these through talking through both programs. So I don't think there's too much more to share here. Again, there's some differences between sectors covered, slight differences in emissions targets, key differences in the price of compliance instruments or allowances. $0 price on carbon in Oregon. Last year's auction, $75 per allowance in Washington. There's flexibility under both programs. I think hopefully folks are kind of getting the gist. There's a lot of similarities. There are also some key differences. That's the takeaway. Okay, we're getting close. This is a new timeline because we're now moving into the present. So again, 2025 of January of last year, the CPP was back in place after a brief pause with the industry litigation that temporarily overturned it based on a procedural technicality, not on DEQ's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions or adopt the CPP. That comes later, so we'll get there. In May of 2025, and actually even before then, folks start hearing, oh, it seems like there's renewed interest in the legislature considering a cap and invest program. This really came to a head in 2025. There was a memo released on what was called the TRIP framework as part of the legislature's consideration of a transportation package. This was after many months of really not hearing what's going on in the legislature on this transportation package. How are we going to pay for all of our transportation needs? Well, one proposal that came out in this May 2025 memo, just a month before the end of session, was we are going to get rid of the climate protection program. We're just going to quickly adopt a cap and invest replacement. And that cap and invest program will generate revenue that we'll then use to pay for our transportation funding woes, which do not just include, not having funding for electric vehicle charging or public transit, but just operations and maintenance, paving our roads, funding, potholes, etc. So hence the name Cap and Pave, or the nickname, I should say. As you can imagine, Climate Solutions, our climate and EJ partners, and our allies in the legislature were pretty concerned about this 11th hour proposal to somehow pay for transportation operations and maintenance with this theoretical cap and invest program. And by the way, get rid of 5 years of work to develop and adopt a cap or climate protection program in the meantime. Thankfully, that was shut down. Not so thankfully, the legislature failed in that session to pass a comprehensive transportation package. I mentioned that because transportation is still at play here and part of what is feeding into this renewed interest in cap and invest in the coming session. Before we get there, though, we'll round out this timeline. So in April of this year, we finally saw a second round of litigation, again challenging the state's authority, and specifically DEQ's authority, to adopt the climate protection program and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned, that first round of litigation back in 2023, the court did not rule on DEQ's authority. It simply said, oh, you didn't check this box in the rulemaking process. There's a procedural error, therefore we're going to invalidate this program. So we were not at all surprised to see that the oil and gas industry and their allies filed another round of litigation back in April of 2026. Climate Solutions and a number of our partners have joined as formal interveners in defense of the state and in defense of the CPP, as we did with the first round of litigation. I will note the court has granted expedited review of that decision, which may mean, or will mean, the process will move much more quickly than it does with a traditional court case. We could get a decision as soon as next year, which is very fast compared to the usual glacial pace of that process. The final milestone that I want to call out is Governor Kotek's Prosperity Council. That's how it's been referred to in shorthand. For those who haven't been tracking, the governor set up an independent Prosperity Council with business leaders and the former Republican majority leader to look at and come up with recommendations for a vision of prosperity for Oregon. That final report came out in June of this year, so just a couple months ago, and it did include, you might guess, a recommendation for the legislature to adopt a cap and invest replacement of the climate protection program. This came after a significant lobby campaign from many folks in the regulated community, Northwest Natural and others, who've spent quite a bit of time talking about how expensive the climate protection program is. It's the most expensive program in North America. This cap and invest program, it's going to be so great. It'll be different. Meanwhile, they're fighting it up in Washington. So there's a lot of dynamics at play, but the Prosperity Council there is significant in the fact that our governor is paying very close attention to and looking for opportunities, as she should, to promote economic development and support Oregon businesses. And so is the legislature as they head into next session. And so there's a lot of weight given to these recommendations. And this one in particular has gotten quite a bit of attention. So all of that leads to, I said fall 2026, we're basically in fall in my mind. We're basically there, right? Where the legislature is looking at what are we going to do next session? What's on deck? And the challenges that they are facing and the things they're hearing about are affordability. How are we going to lower costs? Our economy, how are we going to grow and keep jobs and companies in Oregon? And how are we going to raise revenue as we continue to struggle as a state with our state budget and all of the things that we have to pay for, given where the feds have severely hamstringed us. Okay, so this is, we're going to round it out with kind of key considerations and criteria, and then I'm sure you all will have lots of questions, which I'm very excited to get to. So I think most important to understand is that while Climate Solutions and many of our partners were leading proponents of past cap and invest efforts in Oregon, going back to 2019. Just any old cap and invest program does not constitute a win for climate or a win for Oregon communities. There is such a thing as a bad or weak cap and invest. We already have a very strong regulatory cap and invest through the climate protection program. And so what we have really been trying to make sure that legislators and decision makers more broadly understand as this renewed interest in a legislative cap and invest program gains traction is, again, the benefits that we stand to gain and have already seen through our existing program. And B, if they're going to take a run at it, there's some very important features to get right. We already have a cap and invest, and so if the legislature is going to weigh in, one of the only real differences would be a program that links to other states, because we can't do that with our current program. If you're going to link to other states, as I mentioned, you have to mirror other programs in stringency and key program design features. This gets wonky, as you've probably picked up on pretty quickly. It takes very close attention to detail. Again, it took Washington years to link. They passed it in 2021. They only just linked this summer. Two, the cap is very, very important. And what is just as important is where the investments go. You can't have a mandatory declining cap on emissions if you're not using revenue generated under that program to invest in solutions and support communities in the transition. So similar to Washington's program, as I mentioned, we have to have investments in clean energy solutions and in resilience. And we need to uphold the CPP's priority for investing in environmental justice communities and in our tribes and tribal communities. Third, we have to say this in many contexts, but especially this one, there cannot be any entertainment of rollbacks or delays to our other climate and environmental justice protections. What we could see and what we saw with the TRIP package from last year, the proposal rather, was immediately repeal the CPP. That is not something that we can stand for. As you saw in the initial timeline, there's been now 20 years of conversation. We cannot stand another year or even really another day of delay in implementation. So the CPP would need to stay in effect until any theoretical future program were adopted and in place, fully running, right? But also, we cannot see a preemption of any of our other laws, like our 100% clean electricity law, HB 2021, our clean fuels program, any other local climate protections, right? This is a backstop. The cap is a backstop, but we need it to work in tandem with other programs, just as it does in other jurisdictions. So those are some of the takeaways that I want to leave you all with. There are certainly, political considerations as well, and I'm happy to get into those in any questions. But I'm done talking at you all, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll turn it back to, I think, Dale or Alan to facilitate the Q&A discussion. Thanks for bearing with me on this long history lesson. I hope it was helpful. Those of us on the Zoom cannot hear anything if there are questions being facilitated from the in-person audience.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is CPP enforced now? Can it be enforced by law?
Yes. The CPP, again, it's a regulatory program that was adopted by our Environmental Quality Commission. So it was not a legislatively adopted program, but it is law in the sense that it was adopted by that commission and it is being actively enforced, and their enforcement mechanisms baked into the rules, as well as an oversight role for the Oregon Public Utility Commission, specifically when it comes to how our gas utilities covered under the program are complying with their obligations.
It occurs to me, Dale, we didn't mention to folks on Zoom that they should put their questions in the chat, did we?
We do have some questions.
We do have some, okay. So I'll just make that point. If you're on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat and I'll throw to Dale to ask one.
I will read them out shall we take one of the questions?
We can take a couple more from, hey, okay.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? I heard you mention carbon. What about methane?
Sure. So the methane is theoretically covered, right? So what is covered under the program are fossil fuels, right? So that includes fossil fuels from our gas utilities. As we know, methane associated with natural gas is a key pollutant. I think what I may have been referring to was putting a price on carbon under previous cap and invest programs. That could be, I guess, the more technical version of that is a price on 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So thanks for the clarifying question. there are definitions under both the CPP as well as, for instance, Washington's Climate Commitment Act in terms of what qualifies or constitutes as a covered emission under a respective program. Thanks for the question.
Hello. First off, thanks. This has been very informative. I just have a couple questions. First off, does the price of, if you're linked up with, say, Washington, California, and Quebec are linked, does their price of a carbon unit, is it have to be the same to be linked up? And then I guess another question is, if you are linked, can you sell credits to another state?
Yes, that is a great question. My understanding, and I will say, because Oregon is not part of a linked market, I'm not as up to speed on the technicalities, but my understanding is that the price that is set does not have to be the same across linked markets. So if Oregon's allowances were cheaper than Washington's, covered entities could buy Oregon allowances, and then increasing in demand in Oregon could push Oregon's price up. So what, part of what we saw after, or anticipate seeing with linkage now that Washington is linked, is a reduction in that price of allowances. So I mentioned it was something like $73 at the most recent in-state auction. Very, very high for a cost of a single allowance. What we would expect to see is that go down as they link to other markets, but it doesn't have to match. And then there was a second part of the question that
Could they sell state to state?
Oh, yes. That trading across states is a key part of the flexibility that has some regulated entities interested in a linked market. They've now tried out the Oregon goes it alone model, and they want to be able to trade not just within our four corners, but with other jurisdictions.
I have a question related to the first question you were asked, which was, is the CPP already up and running? My question is more, how susceptible is it for somebody to file a lawsuit and stop it in court?
Yes. So as I mentioned, unfortunately, the CPP has been a frequent target of legal attacks and is currently under threat of active litigation that was filed by many members of the many regulated entities challenging DEQ's authority to have adopted the rules. So that is active litigation that threatens to potentially, stall or overturn the program. Even though that litigation has been filed, just as DEQ did with the previous round of litigation, they are moving forward with implementation. There's been no stay on the program. There's been no pause, which is very, very important. We also know that DEQ worked hand in hand with the Department of Justice and their attorneys in developing the rules to make sure that they were within the bounds of DEQ's authority. So we feel confident that they are within strong legal footing. But again, that litigation has yet to fully play out. The court has yet to even have a hearing, let alone make a decision. And so that legal threat is unfortunately, again, kind of playing into this broader context of a legislative interest in pursuing a replacement.
Could I ask a question before we throw it to the Zoom gang? I want to refer to the elephant in the room and bring politics into this, Nora. It seems to me that the very forces that are trying to institute a cap and invest program are the very forces that killed the effective cap and invest programs that we were developing over a period of many, many years. So my question is, I'm a totally skeptic on this effort. While it would be lovely to link with Washington, California, and Quebec, is that really likely to happen given the forces who are behind the cap and invest idea right now?
I had a feeling you might bring politics into this, Alan. Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head, right? It is suspicious at best that the same opponents who led the industry and Republican walkouts back in 2019 and 2020 are the same entities that are now leading proponents of this potential push heading into next year. I think there are a couple things that I would say. First is I think Kate Brown really called their bluff, right? Like she kept threatening that if the legislature does not act on cap and invest, we're going to do this through a regulatory mechanism. Thankfully, she held to that commitment. We all worked very hard to secure this incredible program. Governor Kotek has sustained that commitment to ensure strong implementation and support for the CPP. And so they now are regulated under the CPP, and they don't like that. Where they do have more influence is in the legislature, right? Where they have more ability to shape and write the rules for the same electeds that they are, actively contributing to the campaigns of, right? There's more politics involved in the legislature than there is through an administrative process. And so there is that. I will say, again, why I brought up Washington is that if we are going to link, there's very limited opportunity for actually watering down the program's design, right? Because it has to be at least as strong, at least as stringent if it's going to link. So I'll leave it there.
Do you have any questions from the Zoom folks?
Yes, we do. Craig Harper asked very good question. What are overburdened communities? And then Randy Knapp answered, and I'll give you a chance to see if you agree. It is a minority, low-income, tribal, or non-English speaking neighborhood that faces a high amount of pollution and environmental harm. These areas suffer from poor health and social conditions because too many factories, power plants, or waste sites are built near them. Your comment?
It's a great question. So this is actually defined in the CCA statute in Washington. I do not have that statutory language memorized, but I could easily pull it up and drop it in the chat. I don't believe I think Randy roughly captured it. I would think of it as comparable to Oregon's definition of environmental justice communities, which is also defined in statute, and that statutory definition is what is included in the CPP rules. So communities that have historically borne the brunt of climate pollution and climate impacts, including but not limited to rural, low-income communities of color, tribal communities, coastal communities. It's just a different term that Washington uses, but I would say similar intended beneficiary populations.
Okay, Helena B. had two questions. The state of Washington has large petroleum refiners and is more than twice as big as Oregon, both population-wise and I believe pollution-wise. What would the number of our non-free allowances be compared to Washington's? And then the second question is, also California auction prices
are half that of Washington, and a big concern of joining Washington to California is that it will drop Washington's carbon price. What is the reason you are comparing to Washington rather than the issues in the bigger, more powerful market that is intended to be linked to?
Thanks, Donna. To answer or to respond to the first question, this is something that would need to, in terms of what would the number of free allowances be compared to Washington's. Allowance designation in terms of is determined based on sector. And so I wouldn't think of it as like compared to states, but really like what does that breakdown look like under a theoretical Oregon legislative cap and invest program? I would, and as I mentioned, there are key features that do have to align closely with the stringency of other programs in order to enable linkage. So there would be some chance for differentiation, but not a huge range. And the reason that I've been referring to Washington is just given it is a more comparable state in terms of size, in terms of, well, you noted there are differences in the fact that we do not have petroleum refineries in Oregon. Our industries are similar and our economies are more similar than, say, Oregon and California. And again, Washington just went through this multi-year process of figuring out what it takes to link. So they have set an even higher bar in terms of what Oregon's theoretical program would need to mirror and look like to enable linkage. We cannot be less stringent than Washington's. So that's why I keep lifting up Washington as our most recent and strongest example of what good looks like and what linkage requires.
Okay, I'm not going to try and pronounce the last name, but Pat asks, will HB 2021 need to be revised as part of Cap and Invest?
Was that Pat Delacroix?
Yes.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Pat. As I noted, a key consideration from our perspective for any cap and invest, any entertaining of cap and invest is we are not preempting or rolling back or weakening existing statute. That includes HB 2021, our clean energy law. As I mentioned, in Washington, their cap and invest, their CCA works as a complementary regulatory tool with their version of HB 2021, CETA. CETA is different from our Oregon's clean energy law in terms of its regulatory approach. But in both cases, right, these would be considered and should be considered complementary programs. And so there would be no need to open up HB 2021. It really would be a matter of what does the electricity sector treatment under a theoretical cap and invest program look like? But there's plenty of examples of these types of policies working in tandem, an opportunity for us to think about this declining cap as an additional lever to achieve our clean energy future. So designed after Washington CCA, a theoretical Oregon cap and invest would really reinforce the goals of HB 2021 and support utilities in achieving their clean energy goals, including through the revenue generated to fund clean energy. But not, I would not entertain opening up HB 2021 personally, and there's not a need to do so. Okay,
Michael Dimbro added on to the question about the overburdened communities. His comment is, I believe that rural and coastal communities are also included. And then we have a question from Angelina Cook. Do revenues generated through Washington's program support ecosystem restoration or just clean energy projects?
Revenue generated under Washington's program, there are some requirements included in the law. There are a few key buckets. The easiest way to respond to your question is those buckets include both climate mitigation, so clean energy related investments to reduce emissions in the covered sectors, as well as resilience activities such as wildfire mitigation, for example. I do believe that, and other natural climate solutions activities as well. So I think, for instance, like habitat restoration or regenerative agriculture would be types of projects that are funded under the climate investment account. And there's also a separate natural climate solutions account. So by my understanding, yes, it's a both and, resilience and mitigation.
Looks like we have one last question from Marilyn Stewart. How can we be thinking about data centers, and how can we fight these even though they would be clean electric, so to speak?
Marilyn, that sounds like a great topic for a future SOCAN gathering. There's definitely intersections with a potential cap and invest program. Concerningly, data centers, or sorry, consumer-owned utilities are not covered under our clean electricity law or under our CPP. And that's where we've seen a lot of data center load growth, and that load growth has been associated with increasing emissions, in addition to the other impacts that we've seen in terms of grid and just achieving our clean energy goals more broadly. I do think a cap and invest conversation or a potential cap and invest policy could be a mechanism. And I know the legislature is considering many proposals around regulating data centers heading into next session. So I was only half kidding when I said you might want to consider dedicating a future meeting entirely to this topic, because there's so much to dig into.
Getting to implementation of this strategy, it would seem that we would not want to trust the polluters to report carbon emissions without testing that. So presumably DEQ would have a role in that. After living in Portland for 20 years, I was not impressed with how they managed emissions in the Portland airshed, both from industrials to heavy metals and all sorts of things. And presumably DEQ or some other agency would need a significant amount of money or budget increase to ramp up their ability to do that and be transparent. And on the other side of the ledger, of course, the fanciful nature of many carbon offsets, especially in forestry, is documented, and a lot of that carbon budget is underground, which is hard to observe, expensive to measure. But after looking at some of Weyerhaeuser's claims, most of them were wrong. So does the plan address how to get an independent measurement of actual carbon emissions and measurement of how real some of the carbon credits are?
Just to clarify, is this question with regards to our existing climate protection program?
I presume that's in the very early stages. You could start with what we have now. Yes, please.
So yeah, the climate protection program relies on reporting to DEQ through the greenhouse gas emissions reporting program. There is a process for that reporting system that applies to emissions beyond those directly covered by the CPP. And I heard in your question/comment, if the legislature were to adopt a cap and invest program, yes, certainly DEQ would need significantly more resources and staff capacity to administer that program. I think the fiscal for the 2020 bill was something like $20 million at least, which would be likely significantly more in today's dollars. But yeah, making sure that our agency is well resourced and staffed to implement is a key part of ensuring that this program, our current program, remains successful, and any future programs are set up for success.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Nora. Let's give Nora a round of applause.